everybody. Welcome to Entr'ACT. I'm here with Bob Franklin, a actor, a director, a wealth of knowledge, a golfer.
Indeed.
Bob, what we're doing is just catching up with some of our theater buddies and asking some questions, generating some conversation about theater. With everything that's going on, the auditorium is empty, but that doesn't mean our hearts have to be. So we just want to check in with people and how have you been doing? How's life with theater on pause?
Well, there's a big hole in my heart and in my schedule, but and I'm not sure what the future will hold given the current situation, but I find things to do. And at my age, I take more naps.
Maybe I need to get my age checked because I feel like I'm napping as much as... I've always wanted to ask you this. What drew you to... Because I know you acted before, obviously you acted before you directed, although maybe there's those circumstances where people jump right into directing, but what drew you to theater, community theater?
Well, honestly, acting in general, when I was young, a kid, I didn't particularly like myself. I spent a lot of time after my parents had gone to bed watching old black and white movies on television and mimicking the facial expressions, the tone of voice, the walking movements, the hand gestures of different kinds of characters. I mean, I learned, what does a private detective sound like? What does a used car salesman look like? How does he talk? How does he dress? How does a priest walk? And all of these things fascinated me, and I kind of incorporated a number of those things into my self because I didn't want to be myself. I wanted to be somebody else. And isn't that the essence of acting?
Yeah.
So I brought with me, when I finally was old enough to participate in community theater, we did not have the good fortune where I was of having a youth wing program, so I was pretty much a full-fledged adult by the time I got involved. But it was something I wanted to try to see whether all those things I had learned could work.
Yeah.
And also, I've always been, as an English teacher, fascinated with words, how they're spoken, how they mean something different when spoken differently.
Right.
I've often said to my cast, I watch rehearsals with my ears as much as with my eyes, listening to how people speak. That's really how I got started as an actor. Becoming a director was something I had always thought about, but until I was too old to play romantic leads anymore, I never really got involved until I was working in Washington, D.C., and was invited by a large Mormon stake to direct Fiddler on the Roof. Part of that was due to my background. Part of it was due to the fact that the director they had originally chosen quit after 2 weeks. And this was an extraordinary experience. I worked with singers who had been part of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, who had been soloists, but had never acted. And it was a challenge, but one that was extremely rewarding for me, to see someone who had never been on stage before, except to sing, become Tevye.
Yeah.
And that was an extraordinary experience. And I did 2 more musicals with them. I hadn't directed any straight plays until I got to Aiken.
Yeah, that's crazy because I mean, maybe I'm still too new, but you're like the Shakespeare guy to everybody around here, you know? Like,
Well,
by virtue of the fact that you taught English, I guess that's what led you into...
And Shakespeare uses language to paint masterpieces. It's not the sort of show I normally choose. I normally choose things that make people think, that make audiences walk out of a theater saying, wow, that was deep, that was something.
Even if it makes them uncomfortable?
Well, sometimes especially if it makes them uncomfortable, because that's what life is.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the shows I've directed, To Kill a Mockingbird, A Few Good Men, On Golden Pond, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Inherit the Wind. These are all powerful productions, and the language is there to support those heavy themes of mice and men, and you are very familiar with that one.
Shout out to the cast of Mice and Men. Yeah. Well, yeah, I guess that sort of leads me into another question, which is, you said it's perhaps the goal is to just at least make people think as they leave the theater. What sort of inspires you when you're analyzing a play, maybe thinking about directing it? What are the things that you look for that sort of grab your attention or jump off the page?
Well, grab your attention is a good expression, because as a director, I don't, surprisingly perhaps, but I don't get to see many plays other than here at the community theater. I was not one to spend time on Broadway, although I was close enough. We just didn't have the money for Broadway tickets.
Oh, preach.
But when I read a play, and this actually, I'll use language that comes from a friend who said, if I'm not drawn to these characters and what happens to them in the first 10 pages, that's a no-go.
Yeah.
I have to be interested in what's happening as I read the play. I don't read them the way we had to read books in high school or college. You're forced to do it. Some were good, some were bad. You had to read them all. I don't have to read a play after 10 pages if I don't like it.
Right.
And I can tell you in 10 pages whether it's worth putting on or not. The language has to be crafted. That's the difference, really, between a good playwright and a mediocre playwright. A mediocre playwright thinks he's telling a story. It's much more than that. A good play is sewn together like a good quilt. And the threads all have to come together.
Right.
Repetition, something most people don't notice. I notice it, and I notice whether it's done purposefully or not. If it's done purposefully and done well, that makes this painting shine. So that's...
Okay, this is another sort of background question, because a lot of people, when they come into the theater, especially if they're not actors or not directors, they see the final product, but they don't know
what goes into
I mean,
it.
I assume most people understand that people work hard to create that final product, but maybe they don't quite see the pieces of what that looks like when you work hard. I've been directed by you twice now for Merchant of Venice and Of Mice and Men. Both times we spent a pretty substantial amount of time just reading it at tables before ever standing up and trying to act, you know? How is that the English teacher in you?
I'm not sure that anyone who hasn't read the play multiple times really can understand his or her character or the themes behind it and how the character elucidates those themes. One of the jobs of a director is to get people not just to understand my vision, but to talk about amongst themselves what else is possible. The advantage of table work is it gives an opportunity to everyone around the table to contribute, to be forced to think about what it is about the role they're playing that's going to fit into this final product. Standing up is helpful. We do movements, we look at what the picture is that's created by the group of actors on stage at any given moment. But understanding what motivates characters to move needs to come long before they're asked to move.
Yeah.
And so, where possible, I like to spend a fair bit of time talking about the play. And I may change my vision based on the creativity of the cast that I have. Your character was one that developed partly through your own desire to see this person as real. And that's what it's all about. I mean, if you don't feel real in the role, then the audience will never see the character as real. How does nervousness get expressed if nervousness is part of a character? How does curiosity get expressed if that's part of a character? These are things that you can talk about long before you ever get up on stage.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is an education prior to a performance, you know?
Well, and for me, I was a teacher. I consider myself still a teacher. And teaching in the classroom means providing an environment in which students or whoever is around you can find their way. Not my way, their way. And that's what directing a play is, too.
Yeah.
The difference is, as a director, there are certain confines within which I ask the cast to stay.
Yeah.
That's part of the vision of what's going on. So, I mean, I'm already looking at how characters will be dressed the fourth or fifth time I'm reading the play.
Yeah,
We don't really talk about that in book work or table work, but the character has to fit the clothes,
Right.
the dress. In Of Mice and Men, the character of Crooks, we put him in bedroom slippers for a reason. This was part of his private little world.
Right.
Gave him glasses because he reads by candlelight, and obviously this probably destroyed his vision.
Yeah.
These are things I'm always thinking about. I don't necessarily communicate them at the outset to all of the cast, but it'll come as we work our way through the show.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of sort of that educational side of theater, acting, directing, what would you say, what would you look back, acting or directing, what would you pinpoint as perhaps like your most educational experience during the run of a show? Is it like a moment? Is it a general takeaway from a whole piece of work?
It's many of those things. For me, it's watching the light go on in somebody's head about 6 weeks into rehearsal when they suddenly realize what I've been trying to say. And it makes sense to them. And they, for me, a rewarding moment is for an actor to come up and say, you know, I never understood this. I've seen this show. I've never understood this character before. I see what you're saying now. And it makes sense to me. That's what bigger reward can you have than that?
Yeah.
You know?
What would you say to someone who's not involved in theater and is sort of like on the fence, especially community theater? Because it's, you know, I guess theater folk kind of get a bad rap because it looks like it's a clique. You know, it looks like we all hang out in this big building and we do secret squirrely stuff and then put on a show like 2 months later. But really, it's a pretty welcoming family once you're in. So what would you say to that person who has maybe come here and seen a play or seen a musical and been like, oh, I want to do that, but they need that final push?
Well, if they're on the fence, it's already 50-50. So why not choose this side?
Yeah.
That's what I would say to them. The worst that can happen is you don't like what you find.
Right. We don't throw
Best
fruit.
that can happen is that you fall in love with what you find and can't stop. We've had a number of people here, and no sense naming any names, but one of the shows I directed, a young lady came just to sing in the choir. She was a singer, and I put her in a role. Scared to death. She never looked back. She has been acting and directing ever since. She just got bitten by the bug. It's a bit like golf for me. I was 9 years old when my father and I split a set of golf clubs, and I've been playing now for 67 years.
Right.
And every day I look forward to going out on the course.
Yeah.
Same thing with theater.
Yeah.
I look forward to it. And you develop relationships.
Excuse me.
Nobody can say you're going to love every person you meet in the theater. There's always a diva here and there. There's always somebody you disagree with. But what's interesting to me, we social relationships are important.
Mm-hmm.
And we find things out about people when you have the time to do that. I can remember, what do you do if you're single and you're looking to date? Well, typical choice is go to a bar. Other people will choose church, or I think where you have more time to develop a comfortable relationship with somebody, that's the best answer. And what's interesting to me about community theater, I mean, we all have our political bents, we all have our prejudices, religious and otherwise. It disappears somehow in community theater. It doesn't matter, because everybody is focused on a different on the same goal, which is to make a show work for an audience.
Yeah. All right, so you've directed musicals, you've directed what I would say regular straight plays, but we all know it's just a straight play, and then you've directed Shakespeare's works. What do you have a favorite? Can you say that you have a favorite, or does it just depend on the piece of work, you know?
I can't say that I have a favorite. I have a favorite Shakespeare play, which hasn't been done, partly because it's extremely complicated and troubling and difficult. For the lead characters, for all of them, and that would be Hamlet, which is, to my mind, probably the greatest play he ever created. But I have done Merchant of Venice, I've done Much Ado About Nothing, I've done Twelfth Night, all comedies of sorts. Merchant of Venice is a problem comedy because it's not really funny.
Well, yeah, it's hard to find something to
In Shakespeare, it's interesting because in comedies versus tragedies, in a tragedy, everybody dies. In a comedy, nobody dies.
Right.
That doesn't mean they don't suffer,
Yeah.
but they don't die. And that's really one key difference between the two.
Okay, so you brought up comedy. I want to talk about, I'm going to be asking some actors what their most embarrassing moment on stage is. They also happen to be my friends, so I feel comfortable asking them that question. I respect you too much to ask you that question. However, but what can you look back on and it just gets you laughing every time, or gets you smiling every time, as maybe an individual show or a moment during a show? I know you've told me stories of having to cover for like a co-actor that's completely lost their lines.
This was a newbie, community theater, and he had only one line.
That's right.
He learned it the very first day, and went through all the rehearsals. And the line was, he played a police officer, and he had to come on stage at some point and tell the detective, the captain, that the men were here, the other police officers. And he was so comfortable. But when opening night came,
Those lights hit.
the lights were in his face, the audience was all seated, and he showed up and he just went blank. And it is the job of other actors to try their best to encourage them to find their place.
Yeah.
And I was playing the police captain, and when I saw him looking like a deer in the headlights, I said, "What is it, Johnson? Are the men here?" "Yes, sir, the men are here," he said. Another funny, not so funny for me. This was a very serious play. I never sang for my father. Gene Hackman played it in the movies and on stage. Played the role that I had played. And it's a story of a very troubling relationship between a 30-year-old man and his 75-year-old father. In the course of the play, the young man has to take his mother, who is also quite old, through the garden. They have a long conversation about the father, and then he puts her to bed. The actress playing my mother was old and didn't realize she was supposed to be on stage for that scene. Was in the dressing room downstairs so I had to play the whole scene as if she were with me.
Right.
I wonder what Mom would have said. Probably she would have told me, and then I gave her line, and then my line, and
Wow.
and that was an embarrassing moment, but it also made me realize that the tension of the fear of mistakes, which will happen. This is live theater. That's what keeps us sharp. That's
Right.
and you take great pride in knowing that you can handle it.
Yeah.
That was a very moving moment for me.
Yeah, because that is probably every actor's worst nightmare, of just being, for lack of a better phrase, being naked on stage,
Yes.
either figuratively or probably even literally for
Yeah.
some people, of just either the cue line's not given, or a track in a musical,
Right.
misfires, or your mic goes out, like any little thing that disrupts what's been routine for rehearsal after rehearsal, it does jolt you.
It does. But if you've rehearsed well, if you've become the character that you are supposed to be, you will get through those issues.
Yeah.
And audiences are remarkably understanding.
They are very forgiving. They are very forgiving. Yeah. What we talked about triumphs on stage and less than triumphs on stage, just being embarrassed. What is your, I guess bucket list would be the phrase, but what are you dying to direct next? What do you really want to?
What I want to direct next, I hope to be directing next, because that was a choice that was offered for this season, which may or may not happen.
Right.
But if I had to direct a show, one show, it would be Hamlet.
Yeah.
That's something that has so much in it. It would require probably 3 weeks of table work, and
yeah, it's crazy because that is the one that most high schoolers read, and I think because it's required reading in middle school. I mean, some middle schools were doing it last I heard, but it's so because by nature of the fact that so many people read it in high school, they might not ever read it again as an adult, and they just assumed it was the easy one that everybody can get because, oh, I read it as a kid. Yeah, it's The Lion King. That's all it is.
But that's one of the issues with Shakespeare, is people have read it perhaps because they've been forced to read it. But reading it and seeing it performed are just two totally different things. I certainly approach that play and all of Shakespeare's plays differently if I'm reading it for understanding or reading it for, sometimes it's not even pleasurable because it's hard work.
Right.
But watching it is just, it's magic. It's magic to see those words, those characters, those actions come alive. And that's the difference between, for anyone, reading a play and watching it. But as a director, when I'm reading a play that I'm planning to direct, I see it in its entirety on the stage as I'm reading it. People talk about...
The first time?
Yeah, not the first time.
Okay.
The first time I read the play, I read it to see what, do I care about these characters? Are they making sense to me? That was a nice turn of phrase. The second, third, and fourth time I read it, I begin to build the entire show. I see, by the time I've read it 5 or 6 times, I see the lighting, I see the costumes, I hear the sound that I want.
Yeah. It's a lot like songwriting a little bit, because it's elbow grease.
It is.
It's very rare for all of it to just fall in your lap.
It never happens that way. It's hard work. Yeah. And that's, I guess, what audiences many times don't understand. You had alluded to this point earlier. They don't know what goes into making something that entertains them. They have no concept of all the hard work that goes in. And it's interesting because as a director, I usually get more adulation from cast members than I do from audiences. Oh, you directed this? Where did you find that great actor who did that? He was so good, or she was wonderful in that. Yes, but they have no idea how long it took to get to that point.
And how much help that actor needed from you, most likely.
Well, but that's sort of the nature of the beast.
Yeah. What would you say is the difference between community theater and the pros? I mean, obviously, there's money involved in a Broadway production that a community theater most likely doesn't have.
Well, of course, there are many professional theaters that don't rise to the level of Broadway, but certainly Broadway has more money. They have backers. They can do things on stage that many community theaters just can't do with sets and lighting, and we just can't.
Right.
But professionals, it's their job. I'm not saying they don't love it, but it's their job. They're doing this for money and to entertain audiences. They have to be on top of their game.
Yeah.
Every single actor, director, first grip, sound man has to be on his game, because those audiences are not forgiving, ever. And critics, we don't have critics as such here in Aiken. Some community theaters do, and they have destroyed the lives of good people by being overly critical of skills. But community theater has different purpose. And again, you had alluded to this earlier. It's a community of people formed to create something to entertain another community of people.
Yeah.
and we do it for love. That the root word of amateur is love. We don't do it for money.
Yeah.
If we did, we'd all be broke, probably. The other thing is that in professional theater, the talent pool for every aspect of the game, whether it's set building or lighting, the talent pool is bigger. That doesn't mean they're necessarily any better, but bigger. So
Right.
if I have a choice of 3 actors or 5 or 6, I'm lucky here. But on Broadway, they have hundreds from which to choose.
Yeah.
And not wanting to make mistakes, they tend to choose those who are a proven quantity. In community theater, because our purpose is different, we can choose people who've never been on stage before, get them started with a role. They may not be the greatest or end up as the greatest actors or actresses in the world, but if the light comes on in their eyes, we've done our job.
Yeah.
And that to me is the value of community theater.
Yeah. Which kind of leads me to, I guess what we'll call our concluding question here. But what voice does, or what voice should a community theater have outside of their building? Like, what role does it serve? Is it for people to come to and see a play? Should it, and it's just, does it stop at entertainment?
Well, for many outside the theater, that's all they care about is entertainment. I've had a number of, and everybody's idea of entertainment is different. I've had a number of friends who have refused to come to my plays because they don't want to be depressed. They only want to laugh.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
some people only want to come to musicals. They just love the music. Fine. So we're not for everybody. But our job is to create something that's as good as it can be, so that those who are interested will be entertained. And by entertained, I don't mean laughing all the time. So don't do all comedies. But the real value of community theater is that it does create an environment in which people can come together for a purpose. That's exactly what a church serves as, or a synagogue. I mean, it's a place to go, to feel safe, to share ideas.
Right.
And community theater is very much like that. It's also a training ground for things far beyond the theater.
Mm.
How many of us, and I count myself among them, feel socially awkward? And this is a safe place to learn how not to be.
Right.
We have a youth wing that is an extraordinary resource.
Yeah.
Not just a babysitting place. It teaches things, and if it's taught by the right people, it teaches good ethics, good manners, confidence.
Yeah.
That can help far beyond the theater.
Yeah.
I mean, there's an audition is nothing more than a job interview in many respects.
Yeah.
It's not asking different questions. It's asking somebody to show me what you have, and that's all a job interview is.
Right.
if you are comfortable doing these things, you'll be successful wherever you go.
Yeah, that's why it's always a marvel to me to find, especially in the youth wing, because they're still sort of coming into who they are as an adult. But some of the most shy kids publicly turn out to be phenoms on stage.
Yes.
Because it's that moment where they can just all bets are off,
and they can be somebody they're not.
Yeah.
And after a while, the confidence you had in being able to be somebody you're not allows you to move in very different circles. I had an educational training that probably was pretty elite, but I am as comfortable shooting pool in a bar as I am in talking to college professors. I wouldn't have been that way had it not been for the things I learned in theater.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a quiver full of arrows by the end of it. Well, thank you, Bob, for sitting down with me and chatting all things theater. Hang in there for the rest of this quarantine time, and
Yes.
we'll hopefully be back on stage soon.
Well, I hope this is all successful in maintaining the interest, at least, in the kinds of things ACT does. And we'll hope for the best.